I was in the middle of a video conference with clients in Tokyo when I heard my 8-year-old daughter Emma screaming in our backyard. I rushed to the window to see her sobbing beside a pile of splintered wood and torn rope. All that remained of the treehouse her older brother Jake had spent 3 months building for her birthday. Standing in the wreckage with a sledgehammer and a satisfied smile was HOA President Richard Blackwood, flanked by 2 board members and a demolition crew who were loading what used to be my children's fortress into a dumpster truck. "Daddy," Emma cried, running toward the house with tears streaming down her face. "They broke our treehouse. They said it was ugly and had to go." I threw on shoes and ran outside, my protective parental instincts overriding every ounce of professional composure I'd maintained during 15 years as a corporate lawyer. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted at Richard, who was examining the tree like he was conducting a post-mortem on his demolition project. "We're removing an unauthorized structure that violated multiple community covenants," he replied without looking at me. "No permits were filed, no architectural approval was obtained, and the construction materials were inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic standards." I stared at this man who had just traumatized my children over a simple backyard treehouse. "Richard, that treehouse was on my private property, built entirely in our oak tree, and wasn't visible from any public areas. You had no right to touch it." Richard finally turned to face me, and I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes that made me realize this wasn't about building codes or community standards. "Actually, Michael," he said, pulling out a folder full of documents, "trees over 30 feet tall fall under HOA jurisdiction as community landscape assets. Any structures attached to protected trees require board approval, regardless of property lines." As he spoke, I watched Emma picking up pieces of the wooden ladder Jake had carved by hand, trying to put her destroyed fortress back together with shaking little fingers. That's when I understood that Richard Blackwood wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. He was a bully who got his kicks for making children cry. And like most bullies, he'd picked the wrong target, because Richard had no idea he'd just destroyed the project of a 14-year-old boy whose mother was a family court judge, whose father was a trial lawyer, and whose 8-year-old sister was about to become the most sympathetic plaintiff in Colorado legal history. My name is Michael Chun, and I need you to understand what that treehouse meant to my family before I tell you how I destroyed the man who broke my children's hearts. My wife Linda and I bought our house in Willowbrook Heights in 2019 because of the massive oak tree in our backyard. It was over a century old, with branches thick enough to support a small building and a canopy that provided shade for half our property. Jake, who was 11 at the time, took one look at that oak and announced his intention to build the greatest treehouse in neighborhood history. Emma, then 5, immediately appointed herself as head architect and began drawing elaborate blueprints that included slides, secret compartments, and a drawbridge. For 5 years, the treehouse remained a family dream deferred by busy schedules, soccer practices, and the general chaos of raising 2 kids while managing demanding careers. Linda was building her reputation as a family court judge, and I was working toward partner at Denver's largest corporate law firm. But everything changed when Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer in March 2024. The treatment protocol was aggressive: surgery followed by 4 months of chemotherapy that left Linda exhausted and unable to maintain her usual superhuman schedule. For the first time in our marriage, I became the primary parent while she focused on fighting for her life. That's when Jake, now 14 and mature beyond his years, stepped up in a way that broke my heart and made me incredibly proud simultaneously. "Dad," he said one evening while Linda was sleeping off her latest chemo session, "I want to build Emma's treehouse this summer. Mom always said we'd do it when things slowed down, but things never slowed down unless you make them slow down." Emma, now 8 and struggling to understand why Mommy was always tired and sick, jumped on the idea with desperate enthusiasm. "Can it have windows? And a rope ladder? and maybe a place where I can have tea parties with my stuffed animals. Looking at my children trying to create something joyful during the scariest period of our lives, I realized the treehouse wasn't just a play structure. It was hope, made tangible. It was Jake's way of giving Emma something beautiful to focus on. While our family faced an uncertain future, we spent the next 3 months working on that treehouse every weekend. Jake did most of the construction with my supervision, learning carpentry skills and problem-solving techniques that no classroom could have taught him. Emma contributed artwork, design input, and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. Linda, on her good days, would sit in a lawn chair and direct our efforts like a general commanding her troops. Higher on the left side, she'd call out, or Emma's right about needing more windows. Pirates need good visibility. The finished treehouse was magnificent, 8 feet square, built around the main trunk with a wraparound deck that utilized 3 separate branches. Jake had installed real windows that opened and closed, a rope ladder Emma could climb independently, and a pulley system for hauling up supplies. Emma had painted murals on the walls depicting her family as superheroes, with Mommy wearing a judge's robe and a cape. It was professional quality construction that would have passed any building inspection, crafted with more love and care than most homes receive. More importantly, it became Emma's refuge during Linda's worst treatment days, a magical space where she could escape to when the adult world became too scary and overwhelming. The treehouse also became a symbol of our family's resilience. When Linda's hair fell out from chemo, we held a hat party in the treehouse where everyone tried on silly hats and took ridiculous photos. When Emma had nightmares about losing her mom, Jake would take her up to the treehouse for brave princess training until she felt safe again. By August, Linda's treatment was successful, her prognosis was excellent, and our family had survived the crisis that had threatened to destroy us. The treehouse had been our sanctuary through the storm, and it represented everything we'd fought to preserve. That's when Richard Blackwood decided it was an eyesore that needed to be eliminated. Richard had moved to Willowbrook Heights 6 months earlier, buying the largest house on our street and immediately appointing himself the guardian of community standards. He was recently divorced, recently retired from some corporate executive position, and recently convinced that his personal taste in aesthetics should dictate how everyone else lived. His first complaint about our treehouse came in late August, delivered as a formal violation notice that accused us of constructing unauthorized improvements without architectural committee approval. I responded with documentation showing that the treehouse was built entirely on our private property, using materials that matched our home's color scheme, and wasn't visible from any public areas or neighboring houses due to the oak's natural screening. Richard's second complaint accused us of creating a safety hazard that could result in liability for the HOA if someone was injured on our property. I responded with photos showing the treehouse's professional construction, safety railings, and structural integrity that exceeded most playground equipment standards. Richard's third complaint claimed that tree-based structures violated community covenants regarding architectural harmony and property value protection. That's when I realized Richard Blackwood wasn't interested in legitimate enforcement of community standards. He was interested in exercising power over families who couldn't fight back effectively. He'd picked the wrong family. Richard's campaign against our treehouse escalated from formal complaints to personal harassment with a speed that suggested he'd been planning something more aggressive from the beginning. In September, he hired a structural engineer to inspect our oak tree for safety violations. The engineer concluded that the tree was healthy and the treehouse was professionally constructed, but Richard rejected the findings and hired a second inspector who wrote a report claiming the structure could potentially pose safety risks under certain conditions. When I pointed out that the second inspector wasn't licensed in Colorado and had been disciplined in Nevada for filing fraudulent reports, Richard dismissed my concerns as desperate attempts to avoid accountability. But Richard's real strategy became clear during the October HOA meeting when he announced his plan to have our treehouse demolished under emergency safety provisions. We cannot allow unauthorized structures that potentially endanger children to remain in our community, he declared to a room of about 20 neighbors. This treehouse was built without permits, without inspections, and without consideration for community safety standards. I stood up to respond, but Richard cut me off. Mr. Chun, your family has had multiple opportunities to address these violations. Voluntarily, the board has voted to exercise emergency powers to remove dangerous structures before someone gets hurt. Richard, I said, my lawyer training helping me stay calm despite my anger. You're talking about destroying my children's treehouse based on a fraudulent inspection report. This is harassment, not safety enforcement. That's when Richard revealed the true scope of his malice. Mr. Chun, I'm concerned about the welfare of children in this neighborhood. A family that allows kids to play in unsafe structures might be engaging in other forms of child endangerment. Perhaps we should involve child protective services in our safety assessment. The room went silent. Richard Blackwood had just threatened to report me to CPS for building my kids a treehouse. I felt something cold and dangerous shift in my chest, the feeling every parent knows when someone threatens their children's safety and security. Richard, I said, my voice very quiet and very controlled, you just made a serious mistake. But Richard was too drunk on his own power to recognize the threat. The demolition is scheduled for next Friday at 9 a.m., he announced. We'll be using professional contractors to ensure the structure is removed safely and completely. That night, I called Linda at her law chambers to discuss what we were facing. Michael, she said after I described Richard's threats, this isn't about a treehouse anymore. This is about a man who's willing to traumatize children and threaten families to prove he has power. That's not HOA enforcement, that's abuse. What can we do legally? Linda was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her judge brain analyzing the situation. Short term, get an injunction preventing demolition. Long term, document everything Richard does and everyone who enables him. Men like this don't stop. With one family, they escalate until someone stops them permanently. I spent the weekend researching Colorado HOA law and documenting every aspect of Richard's harassment campaign. What I found was both encouraging and terrifying. The encouraging news: HOAs had very limited authority over structures on private property, especially when those structures weren't visible from public areas. Richard's emergency powers claim was legally baseless. The terrifying news: Colorado courts were notoriously reluctant to intervene in HOA disputes, and temporary injunctions were difficult to obtain without evidence of immediate irreparable harm. But I also discovered something Richard hadn't counted on: threatening to involve CPS in a harassment campaign was illegal under Colorado's child protection statutes. Using government agencies to intimidate families was criminal abuse of process. On Monday morning, I filed for an emergency restraining order preventing demolition of the treehouse, pending a full hearing on the underlying violations. On Tuesday, Richard hired his own lawyer and filed counter-motions claiming the treehouse posed an immediate safety hazard that justified emergency removal. On Wednesday, Judge Patricia Martinez, no relation to my family, scheduled an emergency hearing for Thursday morning. On Thursday, Richard's lawyer presented their case first: photos of the treehouse, the fraudulent safety report, and claims that waiting for a full hearing would endanger neighborhood children. Then I presented our defense: structural engineering reports confirming the treehouse's safety, documentation of Richard's harassment pattern, evidence of the fraudulent inspection, and recordings of Richard's CPS threats. Judge Martinez was not impressed with Richard's case. Mr. Blackwood, she said, you're asking this court to authorize destruction of a children's play structure based on a safety report from an inspector who isn't licensed in this state and has been disciplined for fraudulent reporting in Nevada. Richard's lawyer tried to interrupt. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, you've admitted to threatening Child Protective Services. Involvement as leverage in this HOA dispute. That's abuse of process and potentially criminal harassment. She granted the restraining order, but with conditions that turn my victory into a trap for Richard. The treehouse will not be demolished pending a full safety inspection by a court-appointed engineer, Judge Martinez ruled. However, if the inspection reveals genuine safety violations, the structure must be brought into compliance at the owner's expense. Richard's lawyer whispered something to him that made his face light up with satisfaction. That's when I realized Richard thought he'd won. He believed he could manipulate the court inspection process, just like he'd manipulated the HOA process. He had no idea that challenging a family court judge's husband in her own courthouse was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The court-appointed safety inspection was scheduled for the Monday after Thanksgiving, giving me exactly 10 days to prepare for what I now understood was going to be a decisive battle. Richard's confidence after the hearing told me he had a plan to manipulate the inspection results. His smug smile suggested he thought he could corrupt or pressure the court's engineer, just like he'd found a fraudulent inspector willing to write false reports. But Richard had made a critical error in judgment. He was treating this like an HOA administrative process where he could influence outcomes through political pressure. He didn't understand that he was now operating in a legal system where Linda had 15 years of experience and extensive professional relationships. My wife's reputation in Colorado family courts opened doors that Richard couldn't even see, let alone manipulate. Michael, Linda said during our strategy session. Judge Martinez appointed her most trusted structural engineer for this inspection. David Kim has testified in over 200 cases, and his integrity is legendary. Richard can't buy him, threaten him, or manipulate him. What if Kim finds problems we missed? Then we fix them, Linda replied. But I've seen Jake's work, and that treehouse is safer than most playground equipment. The real question is what we do when Richard's manipulation attempts get documented in Kim's report. That's when I realized Linda wasn't just helping me save the treehouse. She was setting a trap that would expose Richard's corruption to a family court judge who had zero tolerance for people who abused children and manipulated legal systems. The inspection itself was fascinating to watch. David Kim spent 3 hours examining every aspect of the treehouse construction, testing joints, checking structural integrity, and photographing details that most people would never notice. Jake watched nervously as Kim climbed the rope ladder, tested the railings, and examined the branch attachments that formed the treehouse's foundation. Emma provided running commentary on the treehouse's various features, clearly hoping to convince the inspector that her fortress was too magical to destroy. "This is where I have tea parties," she explained earnestly, "and this window is perfect for watching birds. And Jake made this door so it closes really tight when it's windy." Kim smiled and took notes, but his face gave no indication of his conclusions. The attempted corruption came 3 days later, exactly as Linda had predicted. Richard called Kim's office, claiming to represent concerned community members who wanted to supplement the official inspection with additional safety information. Kim's secretary transferred the call directly to Kim, who listened to Richard's pitch about hidden structural problems and liability concerns that might not be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the property. What Richard didn't know was that Kim was recording the conversation on Linda's advice, and that his attempts to influence a court-appointed expert constituted criminal interference with judicial proceedings. "Mr. Blackwood," Kim said calmly, "are you suggesting that I should alter my inspection findings based on your personal opinions rather than engineering facts? I'm just providing context that might help you understand the community's safety implications," Richard replied, apparently not recognizing that he was confessing to attempted corruption. "Mr. Blackwood," Kim continued, "I'm going to hang up now, and I'm going to report this conversation to Judge Martinez. Do not contact me again." Kim's written report filed with the court 2 days later, was a thing of beauty. The treehouse structure located on the Chun family property exceeds safety standards for residential playground equipment. Construction quality is professional grade, structural integrity is excellent, and safety features surpass those found on most commercial playground installations. But the report's most damaging paragraph was its final section. During the course of this inspection, I was contacted by HOA President Richard Blackwood, who attempted to influence my professional findings through provision of non-factual safety concerns and implied pressure to find violations that do not exist. This attempted interference represents a serious breach of judicial process integrity. Judge Martinez scheduled a hearing for the following Monday to discuss Kim's report and address Richard's attempted corruption. That weekend, Linda and I prepared for what we knew would be Richard's final legal destruction. Michael, Linda said as we reviewed our documentation, Richard just committed multiple felonies, attempted corruption of a court-appointed expert, interference with judicial proceedings, abuse of process, and criminal harassment. He's not just going to lose the Treehouse case. He's going to face criminal charges. What about Emma and Jake? How do we protect them from the trauma of a criminal trial? Linda smiled the cold smile she reserved for child abusers and deadbeat parents who appeared in her courtroom. Richard's going to plead guilty rather than face trial, because if this case goes to trial, I'm going to make sure every detail of his abuse gets documented in public records. He'll take a plea deal to minimize publicity. But first, we had to survive the hearing where Richard would make his final desperate play to avoid accountability. The hearing on December 8th was supposed to be a simple administrative review of the safety inspection report. Instead, it became a masterclass in how judges respond when someone tries to corrupt their legal processes. Richard arrived with his lawyer and a folder full of what he clearly thought was exonerating evidence. I arrived with Linda, our documentation of Richard's harassment campaign, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're about to watch a bully destroy himself in front of a family court judge. Judge Martinez opened the proceedings by acknowledging David Kim's inspection report and its conclusions about the treehouse's safety and structural integrity. The court finds that the structure in question meets or exceeds all applicable safety standards, she announced. The emergency demolition order is hereby permanently dissolved. Richard's lawyer immediately requested permission to present additional evidence that might change the court's findings. Your Honor, the lawyer said, my client has compiled supplementary safety documentation that demonstrates ongoing concerns about this structure's impact on community welfare. Judge Martinez looked amused. Counselor, are you suggesting that your client's opinion carries more weight than a professional engineer's factual assessment? No, Your Honor, but because, Judge Martinez continued, that same professional engineer documented your client's attempt to corrupt his inspection through provision of false information and inappropriate pressure. Would you like to address that issue? The temperature in the courtroom dropped about 20 degrees. Richard's lawyer clearly hadn't been informed about his client's attempted corruption. Your Honor, the lawyer stammered, I'm not aware of any inappropriate contact between my client and the court's inspector. Judge Martinez pulled out Kim's report and read directly from it. During the course of this inspection, I was contacted by HOA President Richard Blackwood, who attempted to influence my professional findings through provision of non-factual safety concerns and implied pressure to find violations that do not exist. She looked directly at Richard. Mr. Blackwood, did you contact David Kim to discuss his inspection findings? Richard's face was flushed with panic, but he was too arrogant to admit wrongdoing. Your Honor, I merely provided additional context that I felt would be helpful for his assessment. What kind of context? Safety concerns that might not be obvious to someone unfamiliar with the property history. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, are you testifying under oath that you attempted to influence a court-appointed expert's findings based on your personal opinions rather than engineering facts. That's when Richard's lawyer finally understood what was happening and tried, desperately, to stop his client from confessing to criminal corruption. Your Honor, perhaps we should schedule a continuance so I can properly advise my client. But Richard was beyond help. His narcissism wouldn't let him admit that a family court judge was smarter than he was. Your Honor, I was trying to protect children in our community from a structure that poses genuine safety risks, regardless of what some engineer says in his report. Judge Martinez smiled coldly. Mr. Blackwood, you just admitted to attempting corruption of a judicial proceeding. You've also admitted that you reject the findings of a licensed professional engineer based on your personal, unqualified opinions. She turned to the court reporter. Please ensure this testimony is clearly transcribed for the district attorney's office. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished destroying Richard Blackwood. Mr. Chun, she said, I've reviewed your family's documentation of Mr. Blackwood's harassment campaign. Would you like to present evidence of the pattern of abuse your children have experienced? I stood and presented the timeline Linda and I had prepared. Richard's escalating violation notices, his threats to involve CPS, his hiring of fraudulent inspectors, and his demolition threats designed to traumatize children. Your Honor, I concluded, Mr. Blackwood has systematically targeted my family because he disagrees with our parenting choices. He's weaponized HOA processes to terrorize children and threaten our family stability. Judge Martinez reviewed our documentation with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent 15 years protecting children from abusive adults. Mr. Blackwood, she said finally, you've admitted to corruption of judicial proceedings, harassment of a family with minor children, abuse of HOA authority, and threatening to involve government agencies in personal vendettas against families you dislike. Richard tried one last desperate defense. Your Honor, I was elected to protect our community's standards and property values. Everything I did was within my authority as HOA president. That's when Judge Martinez delivered the legal destruction I'd been hoping for. Mr. Blackwood, using your position to terrorize children isn't community protection, it's child abuse. Threatening to involve CPS to intimidate families isn't HOA enforcement, it's criminal harassment. Attempting to corrupt court proceedings isn't community leadership, it's multiple felonies. She paused to let the weight of his situation sink in. I'm referring this entire matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. I'm also issuing a protective order preventing you from any contact with the Chun family or their property. Finally, I'm forwarding your conduct to the State Bar Association, since I assume someone with your arrogance has a law license that needs review. As the gavel came down, Richard's face went through a sequence of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally, the dawning realization that his campaign against my children had just destroyed his freedom, his finances, and his reputation. His lawyer was already packing up files and preparing to withdraw from representation of a client who just confessed to multiple felonies in open court. But the moment that gave me the most satisfaction came as we left the courthouse. Emma, who'd been staying with Linda's parents during the hearing, called to ask if her treehouse was safe. Yes, baby, I told her. The mean man can never hurt your treehouse again. And he can never hurt any other children either. Good, Emma said firmly. Jake worked really hard on our treehouse, and it makes me happy. I mean, people shouldn't be allowed to break things that make kids happy. From the mouths of babes, Richard Blackwood's criminal trial became a cautionary tale about HOA abuse and child endangerment that made local legal news and reformed how Colorado courts handle community association disputes. He was convicted on 6 felony counts: attempted corruption of judicial proceedings, criminal harassment, abuse of process, conspiracy to interfere with parental rights, and 2 counts of child endangerment for using psychological terror tactics against minors. His sentence was 18 months in state prison plus 5 years of probation with restrictions on any involvement in community governance. He also paid $75,000 in fines and restitution to cover our legal fees and Emma's counseling costs. Most importantly, Richard's case established new legal precedents for prosecuting HOA officials who abused their authority to target families with children. But the real victory was what happened to our family and our community after Richard's destruction. The Willowbrook Heights HOA, embarrassed by the criminal conviction of their former president, completely restructured their governance and enforcement policies. New rules prohibited targeting families over children's play equipment, required legitimate safety concerns to be documented by licensed professionals, and established appeals processes that prevented individual board members from wielding unchecked power. Emma's Treehouse became legendary in our neighborhood. Kids would ask their parents if they could build treehouses like Emma's, and several families started backyard construction projects that brought children and parents together in ways that strengthened our entire community. Jake, now 15 and proud of his construction skills, started a small business, helping neighbors build safe, beautiful play structures for their kids. His first client was Mrs. Rodriguez, whose grandson wanted a treehouse exactly like Emma's but adapted for his wheelchair accessibility needs. Linda's cancer remained in remission, and she'd learned that fighting for our family's right to create joy had been more healing than any medical treatment. Most meaningfully, Emma had learned lessons about standing up to bullies that would serve her well throughout her life. "Daddy," she said one evening as we sat in the treehouse watching the sunset, "Mr. Blackwood was really mean, but he taught me something important." "What's that, sweetheart?" "When people try to break things that make you happy, you don't let them. You fight to protect the happy things, and you make sure they can't break other people's happy things either." I hugged my 8-year-old philosopher and marveled at her wisdom. "Emma, that might be the smartest thing anyone has ever said about bullies and justice. Plus," she added with the practical thinking that made her such a formidable opponent despite her age, "now other kids know they can build treehouses without mean people bothering them." She was right. Richard's criminal conviction had created legal protection for children's play structures throughout Colorado. His attempt to terrorize one family had instead established rights for thousands of families. The treehouse Jake built for Emma's 8th birthday was still standing strong too. Years later, weatherproofed and reinforced to last for decades. Emma had added new decorations, Jake had built additional features, and Linda had contributed a small library nook where Emma could read during quiet afternoons. But the treehouse's most important feature wasn't architectural, it was symbolic. Every time neighborhood children played in Emma's fortress, they were celebrating the principle that creativity and joy and childhood wonder are more powerful than adult meanness and bureaucratic abuse. As I climbed down from the treehouse that evening, I thought about Richard Blackwood serving his sentence and hopefully learning that destroying children's happiness was not only morally wrong but criminally punitive. His campaign against our family had been designed to prove that he had power over people who couldn't fight back. Instead, he'd learned that attacking a trial lawyer's children while threatening a family court judge's husband was the most expensive mistake a bully could make. But more importantly, he taught an entire community that protecting children's right to play, create, and find joy was worth fighting for, and that adults who tried to weaponize authority against kids would face consequences that extended far beyond HOA governance. Emma was right. When people try to break things that make children happy, you don't let them. You fight to protect the happy things, and you make sure they can never hurt other kids again. Sometimes justice comes through criminal prosecution and legal precedent, but sometimes it comes through the simple act of making sure that every child in the neighborhood knows their treehouse dreams are safe from adult bullies who mistake cruelty for authority. Richard Blackwood had tried to destroy one treehouse and ended up creating legal protection for every treehouse in Colorado. That's what we call poetic justice, built one board at a time in the branches of an old oak tree.